If you have landed on this episode and you're not sure you really want to listen to the whole thing because the topic is either intimidating or overwhelming or a downer to you, don't press pause. Just give yourself the gift of listening to Dr. Joe Lee talk about substance use disorder in ways that I promise you've never heard anyone talk about it before, because this is a tricky and messy and uncomfortable and scary topic that's all about humanity and open-mindedness and communication. And Vanessa, help me convince people to keep going past the introduction and listen to this episode.
So Joe Lee, who's president and CEO of Hazelden Betty Ford, he's a really fascinating mix. I mean, he's triple boarded he's a medical degree. He has a board certification in child and adolescent psychiatry and an adult psychiatry.
Which is really hard to be triple boarded.
Which is really a lot of school.
It's a lot of boarded.
But he's really interested in the humanity of people. And he's really interested in reaching young people and finding ways to communicate with young people, mostly by hearing them and being in conversation with them in empathic and compassionate ways. And all of the things that he talks about relate to any aspect of caring for a kid, a teenager, a young adult. And we just learned so much from him. He's really, really fascinating, really funny. And it's an episode that everyone needs to listen to, whether you have addiction in your family or don't, whether you are in recovery or not, whether you're worried about substance use disorder for your kids or not, because it's really about how do we get to be human beings in the world and recognize the humanity of other people.
Yeah, what she said. So here's the episode. We hope you enjoy it. Hi, Joe.
Hi, Tara. How are you?
I'm great. We are thrilled to have you here. We are beyond excited for a conversation. I love when it's two doctors against one non-doctor. It's sort of like there goes Vanessa's pal. But Vanessa's an honorary doctor now, so she's welcome into the fold.
I didn't have to go to medical school. I just had to co-host a podcast and I got a doctor.
Exactly. Little M, little D. Joe, talk to us a little bit as we kick this conversation off about your own personal path and what led you to be now the president of the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation and work with substance abuse disorders.
Gosh, it's been such a blessed journey and also kind of an accidental journey in many ways. I, like many people across the world, have substance use and addiction in my family tree. My grandfather, who grew up in Korea as a farmer during the Japanese occupation of Korea a long time ago. I never met him. Reportedly, he had struggles with alcohol and gambling. So it's in my family tree as well. But I am not a person in recovery. I learned about addiction through my medical training. I did residency at Duke University in general psychiatry. And in my experience there, you could understand why people stigmatize addiction because you would see people in the emergency room, for example, at their worst moments, dragged in by the police. They're high or, intoxicated on something. So you could get an understanding of why the nurses and the people in the hospital would have a reaction to people with addiction and the moral shaming and the labeling. But I had this really incredible experience at Duke where I'd be in the emergency room one month and I would see patients in that presentation, did my best to be compassionate. And then we did a rotation at a place called Fellowship Hall in Greensboro, North Carolina, where I would actually see some of the same patients that I saw in the emergency room now on a different trajectory, and they were transformed people. And so I was really inspired because when you practice medicine, you really want to hit that home run. You really want to make a difference, see that difference. It's incredibly gratifying. And that's what I found in addiction medicine. I saw these people in recovery, and I think it's what every physician kind of dreams of, the kind of difference that you want to make for people. So I continued my training at Johns Hopkins. I was a child psychiatrist, did some addiction, but not predominantly, and then decided that I wanted to get more training in addiction, and came to Hazelden in 2008. And I tell my kids don't think it's funny, but I tell a funny story of getting lost in the snow and the people rescuing me and building an igloo or something. And then when the spring came, I was in Minnesota, and I've been here ever since. So
I think it's hilarious.
Yes, because it's, because the winter's here, but it's a great state. We're a national organization, but we're headquartered in Minnesota. And I came here as a psychiatrist, just as a child psychiatrist, then became medical director, started to do a lot of different things, and media, publicity stuff, academic training. And suddenly had enough opportunities and experiences that in 2020, and that was the summer with the murder of George Floyd and the pandemic. Our CEO at the time, Mark Mishik, a great CEO, retired, and I saw an opportunity for change within the organization. So threw my hat in the ring humbly, and now 3 years later, here we are. So.
One thing you didn't mention, Joe, is a particular training you have, which is relevant to this conversation, but it's relevant for our listeners to every aspect of caring for kids and teens. And that is motivational interviewing therapy. And you told us about this work when we met a couple months ago, and we're going to come back to it throughout this conversation, but it's so fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about what that kind of therapy is and how you use it in the work you do, but people will be able to extrapolate how relevant it is in a variety of ways in working with teens?
Yeah, motivational interviewing is primarily a listening skill. It is a way to do therapy, I would say, more than a kind of therapy, meaning you can deliver any kind of therapy through the skills and spirit of motivational interviewing. I became a trainer a number of years ago now, and then within our organization seeded it. So now we have 7 or 8 trainers throughout our national organization, and we do trainings all the time. We go to Delta Airlines and hospitals, and we train people in this motivational interviewing because it is literally like magic, because it is a listening skill. So much of being a doctor when you're trained is giving information, sharing your expertise. You're the person with the solution, and you impart that upon the patient. And motivational interviewing is fundamentally humanistic. You have this belief that people, young people, have the wisdom and that they know themselves the best. And your job is to help them really see the runway clearly, not muddled by all the things that are going on. And you trust in their goodness and their ability to overcome what they can. And so you impart a lot of skills that way. But it's a lot of reflective listening. So, for example, if a young person says to me, I'm really done using fentanyl, but I want to continue to smoke marijuana, a response early in my medical training, and I laugh at it because I probably did this, is I might say like, well, that's a great step, but you should really think about the developmental aspects of marijuana on your brain, and in motivational interviewing, you say something like, tell me why you want to stop using fentanyl. And notice I didn't touch the marijuana part, but I'm taking the win. I'm taking what motivation calls the change talk, right? And I'm charging that young person up like a battery to make them believe in their own capacity for change. And so, but I use that in leadership. I use that through our organization. Our culture models that. We have a deep tradition of recovery in Hazelden, Betty Ford, and motivational interviewing, brings that forth, that listening skill. And so, it's a universal. I teach it to family members, parents, teach it to young people so they can listen to each other. We live in such a point counterpoint. What's the meme? How do you amplify the message louder and faster than somebody else? And it's really a lost art form, how to listen to people, not just what they're saying, but what they're really trying to communicate.
So my own background, when I graduated from college, I had gotten into medical school, but I wasn't sure I wanted to go. So I took what was then called a year off and has been rebranded the gap year. I worked in inpatient rehabilitation in New York City in an adolescent inpatient unit, and inpatient and outpatient. And one of the things that I struggled with, being not a substance user myself, But I was really interested in this population. I had a lot of reasons to be really interested. One of the things I found really challenging was how to believe someone. So like in that motivational interviewing approach, it's a very interesting thing. I want to quit fentanyl, but I don't want to stop weed or marijuana.
Mhm.
There's this first step, this first hurdle, which is do you really want to quit? And that's the question, right? The why. But can you help walk us through a little bit? What if people are stuck on I don't believe it. I don't
Mhm.
believe you. You're saying when I was working, it was the early 90s. There was this saying, first you got to talk the talk and then you walk the walk. And the idea was
Yeah.
whether it was about substances or anything else, sometimes you just have to say it enough times to really begin to believe it and then to want it. So it wasn't a judgmental statement. It was just a statement of order of operations. So how do you use motivational interviewing when you may not believe and the interviewee may not believe either really what they're saying?
And can I just want to interject. So part of the source of Cara's question, Cara, if I can,
go
based
for it.
on having been in a family also that had substance use disorders, is there's a loss of trust somewhere along the way
Right.
in a relationship with someone who has a substance use disorder. And so your starting point is maybe not the most generous starting point that it might be with just like
That's right.
someone else or in your family or someone you work with. And so you're almost starting at a deficit. And so, Cara, to your point, it's like the generosity of spirit you might have had with someone else somehow, like you're at a different starting point. Is that a fair kind of contextualization of the question, Cara?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. I think the great thing about motivational interviewing, what it does is it helps people through a state of ambivalence. And that is when you're on the fence about something. Like, do I want Italian food or sushi for dinner? I don't know. So you can use it for anything, right? And it helps people change and make a decision in a way that is consistent with their own values. And you can suspend disbelief. So I'll give you a really great example because it's a dance. And so like if you're guiding and dancing somebody, not telling what to do, you don't have to have conviction that they really took a step in that direction. You see what I'm saying? Like, did you really mean to take that step? Did you really mean to twirl that? That's an abstract question. So I'll give you a perfect example. You'll see a lot of people say, I don't have a problem. I can stop whenever I want. Okay. So, the classic response would be like, I don't believe you, right? You have a problem. You double down on the problem. And in motivational interviewing, you might say something like, gosh, you believe that if you really wanted to, you do have the skills to stop, so you take the win. And so you don't have to make a judgment, and you shouldn't make a judgment about the authenticity of that statement, because you can just continue to move people along. And they might be like, yeah, if I really wanted to, I could definitely stop. And then you might say, gosh, if you were going to stop, what would be your best reasons to do so? Then you might ask, like, if you were to do it, what would that look like for you? What would be the next steps? So it doesn't often have to start with the place of authenticity. Even people who really deep down want to change may not be fully aware of all the hurdles ahead, right? So this kind of, it's like epistemology. What do you know? Like, and so even if someone has conviction that they want to change, they may not know all the obstacles. They may not know their relationships are going to change, or that they may have to change friend groups and, all that. So there's a beautiful place where you can just be humanistic and suspend the judgment, and you're going to get movement and change in people anyway.
That's incredible. It's like the trust gets to go to the side, and you get to it's not a question of trust or not trust. That is secondary.
And it's not a moral judgment. The interviewer, right, has to live in a place where you kind of, as you say, suspend disbelief. And by the way, anyone listening, like, you're thinking in your head of 10 scenarios with your kid in the last week, having nothing to do with substance use disorders, having to do with homework and laundry and walking the dog and filling out a form, right? There's a million ways in which we can motivate our kids by removing the moral judgment, by suspending disbelief, by taking the win, as you say, Joe, and just like rolling with it and seeing where the person you're in conversation with takes that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give another example because there is a way to kind of diagnose where people are in that change trajectory. So the spirit of motivational interviewing is the most important thing. Humanism, empathy, making sure that person feels dignified, giving them the benefit of the doubt, as it were. But there is also a way to kind of accurately diagnose where they are. And you just listen to the verbs. The best motivational interviewing lecture I heard, I forget the doctor's name, he was a physician in North Carolina, gave a talk, and he used a metaphor, and I don't know if it's his or somebody else's, of a wedding. And in motivational interviewing, you listen to the verbs that people use. So think about two people at an altar and they're exchanging vows. Think about the verbs that they use. They don't say like, I should marry you. They don't say, I can marry you. I have to marry you. I'm able to marry you. I must marry you. They say, I will and I do. And you can kind of see the gradient of the strength of the commitment increasing as the verbs change. You see what I'm saying? Can to should to must. I have great reasons to. I will. I'm committing. And it really exists in that continuum. And that's why people say, I will, I do. It's commitment language. So you can listen to a young person's language, still withhold judgment, and because you're trying to move them along. But if they say, I know I should do my homework, they may not do it that day. And what you want to get them to is, I am going to do my homework. I am planning to do my homework this evening.
What if they say, I did my homework, when in fact you are pretty sure they did not do their homework?
Yeah. Sometimes that happens where they're just not being completely honest about what the facts are. But,
Right.
Even in business and in kind of high level relationships that, we have with companies and employees, you can tell from the verbs, like how people are actually thinking about things.
It's such a
I'm going to
good
pay
trick.
attention. I'm going to pay attention to the verbs. So a lot of families have histories of addiction, have people with addiction in their families. And we get asked a lot, how and when do I talk to my kids or kids in my life about this topic? And it's not necessarily because they're in an acute situation where they're worried about one of their kids. They're thinking long-term preventative care, wanting to be as proactive and constructive as they can. But also they're like, I don't want to scare the crap out of my kid. I don't want them to judge this relative who may have had this issue over the years. Like, what are some guideposts? Car, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I mean, I think it's going to be different for different families, but as Vanessa alluded to, both of us come from families where there is somewhere along the family tree, like so many, like yours, there are substance use issues. And for me, in my family, they're very, very stark. They're not subtle. And the lack of subtlety is horrible and a gift. It's horrible because this is an illness that has been a lifetime struggle. And all of the consequences that you see in every movie and that you read about in every book they play out in real life. It's a gift because there's no hiding it. And so as my kids were growing up in a scenario like that, it was actually very easy to point to the example of what the consequences of this behavior. And, this is, and they would ask, what happened here? And right or wrong. And I don't think there's a right or a wrong here. But I labeled it for them when they were very young and said, this is what substance abuse disorder looks like. These are the substances that were involved. This is what happened to their brain. And it was, frankly, for my children who are now 19 and 21, they talk about it a lot as being kind of the angel or devil on their shoulder, informing them when they had choices to make all the way through middle and high school about what they were or weren't going to put into their body. They would be like, oh, yep, got that. That is a very important data point for me to carry with me. And it's going to change the way I make decisions. It feels to me, Joe, like that is almost the easier path through when it's so obvious and insidious, right? And it's harder when it's more subtle or when someone is functional despite their use. When someone is an alcoholic or is using drugs and is able to hold a job and to stay sort of socially connected, but everyone's worried about them, but they haven't fallen off the cliff there.
Yeah, it's much harder when it's not so stark, as you say. And so if a parent came to me and said, hey, my family's in this gray area, and they came in much the same way that you presented, Vanessa, I would stay in that motivational interviewing in my spirit and give them an affirmation to say, it's really important to you to invest and plant seeds in your relationship now. Mm-hmm. You're really thinking about it. I would make them feel good so that they don't feel weird about doing that. So that's the first thing I do. And then I'd ask permission to share some information. And the metaphor I use is investing, like in a bank or, in stocks. And so much parenting turns into like tactics in the moment at Thanksgiving dinner. What do you say to your kids? And it is probably the biggest mistake of all parenting paradigms, because it is the sustainability of the investment that matters. It is putting money into the bank, letting it grow so you can pull from it when you need to. And if people have that mindset, then they don't pass up opportunities to, make an investment. And there are so many age appropriate investments to make, things you see in the movies, people you might see out and about, right? Stories you hear about on the news. And I think parents should seize every opportunity, regardless of risk in their family, to do so. It's just a smart investment. I mean, we think about, I remember when I went to college, there's a lot of stuff I didn't know. I don't blame my parents, but like they didn't make investments in like how to take care of my, rundown car or how to do laundry, or you see what I'm saying? And there's so many things with our kids where you can't all of a sudden teach them about money management or using their time. You got to plant those seeds. And I think health is just the same way. You got to talk about it early. They have to hardwire that thinking and behaviors. And Cara and your family looks like that held, and that's great. I see a lot of families where there's high risk in the family where that happens. But I think a lot of people ignore it. They get overrun by, social norms and, all the kind of stuff that parents deal with.
Joe, can you give us some language for people looking for some scripting about how to wade into that language? I'm thinking about, people who have kids in middle school and the parents have a sense they're going to start to be exposed to substances, with friends or something like that. And they want to get ahead of it, but they're trying to find the right language to kind of bring it up. How would you frame both the sort of definition of substance use disorder and also how to contextualize it for kids without making it like a moral failing, right? It may be somebody they love, they really care about who struggled with it. Yeah. They may not have it in their family at all, but you want to teach, as you say, the humanism that every person deserves dignity. And so when we talk about these issues, it's not with demonization. And so what's language that you like to use in that setting?
Well, gosh, there's such a wide context there, but let's imagine a situation where there's some risk within the family, but not definitive. And you guys have come upon some kind of media moment where they're normalizing the use, and your young teenager is, upon this. I think it's important to sit them down and say, look, it's important that you see the whole story here, because in that movie we saw, or that, image that we saw, it was this characterization of it. But you should also know there's a significant number of people who, through no fault of their own, get really carried away with this. And it is very damaging to their lives. And then there's lots of examples that you can use for young people in a way that they would understand. They're on their phones, they're on video games. They have friends that they will tell you, like my son tells me his friends who play video games too much.
Right. Oh yeah. They're so good at throwing their friends under the bus.
Yeah. So, but they understand kind of this non-judgmental magnetic pull that people have towards certain behaviors that are reinforcing. And that's not to call everything an addiction, but I think there are so many examples in modern times to point young people to, more so than before. If you think about it, there's much greater opportunity now than there was 20 years ago to educate young people through all the trappings of modern society about things that can get carried away and really impact someone's health.
Do you guys have information on your website that parents can go to pull just sort of like some facts and figures and stuff like that people could use?
Yes, we have information on our website, but there are academic websites, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. I used to be on the substance use disorder committee there, and they have a Facts for Families page, which I often reference people towards. And so there's a ton of websites. The National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA, they have a site, and so our webpage can be helpful. So there's a lot of resources, and we have a ton of family resources for everyone on different parts of the journey, because when addiction strikes, it strikes the entire family. It really is not an individual journey at all. It is absorbing for the entire family unit. So it's worth the investment.
We'll link to a bunch of those pages in the show notes as well.
Right.
I just want to get granular about something that comes up a lot, which is this fine line between kids being open with their trusted adults about their substance use versus like sort of keeping the door open versus shutting the door in terms of these conversations, and where encouragement sits. And here's what I mean by this. As kids progress through middle and high school, it's the rare kid who is not exposed to substances in a number of different settings. Certainly they see them all over their digital media and TV and movies and all that, but in real life, these substances around them all the time. And so there's this parenting philosophy that presents in lots of different ways. It's safer to have the party at my house, or, you can always talk to me about your substance use and I'll never judge, or, they're versions of the same thing, which is sort of a very understandable goal of keeping the door open and the communication flowing. However, the kids will tell us that sometimes that feels permissive or encouraging.
Yeah.
And for that small group that's going to go on to have an issue with substances, and maybe we can get into some numbers about what the percentage of kids who are going to have a problem actually, how big are those numbers? But like those parents then later feel a lot of guilt, right? They opened a door, but they didn't set clear rules, or they didn't create enough anxiety or shame. But anxiety and shame are not helpful. So like, how do you thread that needle? What's your best advice?
Yeah, I think my first advice for parents is to go on a journey to know themselves and their family, and to assess their own risk. And you would do this like if a certain kind of cancer ran through your family, you would want to know kind of your full risk. Or if a certain metabolic syndrome ran through your family, you would want people to know. If you have a certain kind of skin cancer, you want everybody wearing sunscreen, so because your message is going to be contextualized on your own risk. And I think people need to be courageous to look in the mirror at their own family tree, their own journey, to know their family, their family culture, their norms, their way of communication, but also their medical risk. And then based on that, you gear up your communication appropriately. I think there's something very American about the way we parent, where we have this very laissez-faire. We want them to kind of, 18 years old and car in every garage and 2 chickens in every pot or something. And we have that, and it stays with us as Americans. And I would say there's a lot of risk in taking that journey, and I think parents really should be more like CEOs of their home. They should really think about, who are we? Where do we want to go? What messages do I want to send? It's not about controlling your kid or anything like that, but I think depending on that risk, that message can be stronger or softer, because at the end of the day, there could be a life pending on how that message is interpreted. And so openness is important. But I wouldn't go to the stage of like everything's open and not, because like you're going to have a reaction if your child used something. What you want to do over time, again, going back to the investment metaphor, is invest in that trust so that it doesn't have to be communicated. You just they know instinctively that if there's something that they can come to you with, that they can talk to you about, and you just kind of open that communication line, and it ends up playing out really well. And the research, it's the difference between like an authoritative versus an authoritarian,
right,
parenting model. And that's what you want, but you don't want something that's so passive, because I do see risks, and the research also shows it in both being too authoritarian, right, where they hold secrets, and then being too permissive, there's risks.
Right. And what are the numbers? What, from your vantage point, what are the important statistics that parents should have either in the back of their brains or should share with their kids?
Gosh, I don't have all the statistics on top of my head, but a great website to go to is Monitoring the Future. It's a decades long research study done by survey by University of Michigan, funded by the government. And what's really interesting about those numbers as trends is the pandemic actually created a decrease in youth substance use. And I have a theory on that. It's probably a hypothesis, but substance use travels through a kind of a social contagion. And when young people are isolated and they're just on their phones and they're not talking to each other, it limited some of that contagion effect of substance use. So some of the use rates have dropped in the pandemic and they haven't gone back up. And so that's good news on the whole. But there are some warning trends like Delta 8 THC, which is a synthetic kind of the psychoactive part of THC that you can get from hemp or other things that people will distill. That's on the rise in the States. A few years ago, it was vaping nicotine, and so there are these trends that move through. And then, of course, for the higher risk youth, educating young people about fentanyl and how it's not as obvious as, hey, here's some fentanyl, do you want to take it? But more that it's going to be cut into what you think is Adderall or what you think is Xanax. And so there's a lot of things to educate people on. But more than the numbers, I think parents would be very wise to pay attention to their child's social trajectory, who they hang out with, where their influences are. Those things are very, very telling. You can actually predict which young people might be at risk for substance use in elementary school.
Okay, so you got to talk about that. Walk us through that statement.
Yeah, so just like now, risk is not definitive. It does not mean it will happen. Just like a risk for heart disease does not mean it will become heart disease. Okay, it's just risk. But they've done a lot of research studies generationally looking at offspring of people and whatnot and who ends up developing like a marijuana use disorder, cannabis use disorder, or alcohol use disorder. And they converge on some kind of psychometrics, social variables, and you kind of have to pull this together. And there's a wealth of information on that. And what they find is that, there is definitely a big component of addiction that is genetic. It's not anyone's fault. There's a predisposition for it. I describe it to young people as it's no different than if you're attracted to somebody more than someone else. You can't, that's not that's not a moral problem. That just happened. If you like some food more than other people, that's not, you weren't at fault for that, and so, and they track these kind of psychological variables, behaviors, social norms over time. And some of these are fairly predictive of young people who might be at higher risk. And some of those details wouldn't surprise people, or some early kinds of disruptive behaviors, certain types of risk-taking behaviors, moving into a high-risk social group, especially in middle school when people start to, so some of these things wouldn't surprise people, but some of them would, because, what I find in all my years of clinical experience, having done thousands and thousands of biographies, basically, and asking parents about birth history and were they full term or preterm and just milestones and the whole thing. I find that a lot of young people who are prone to addiction are what I would call risk-taking psychologically. And risk-taking is not necessarily impulsivity, because young people are impulsive. Risk-taking does not have to occur in the moment, and where there's a storm of emotions. It does not have to be that kind of thing. It can be a fairly calculated risk. And people who are risk-taking, they tend to think about the positive reinforcements more than they do the consequences. And some of them, the sting of a certain consequence over time tends to fade much faster than other people. So they might be young kids. Yeah.
Meaning the positive consequences like social validation versus being grounded. Like, is that what you mean? Weighing the consequences versus the positive reinforcement?
Right.
That's right. So a young person, I'll give you an example, and I'm not saying this is predictive because I don't want parents listening to this to freak out, but it's a good example. Let's say you have a young person and they procrastinate, right? And they make a mistake in school and they're like, never again. I have learned, you know what I mean? I'm
going to plan ahead. Yes.
From now on, and in that day, they mean it. They mean it. They really mean it. So there's no point in questioning, like, whether they, they're telling the truth or not. They mean it. But as a function of time, okay, the power of that moment fades for everybody. And for some people, it fades faster. So day one, never going to do it again. I'm going to, be on day two, day three. Well, I can do that homework next week. And that you can actually graph this, in people. And people who are risk taking, just the sting of those consequences sometimes fades much faster than average. And then they are also more reinforced by the upside, you know what I mean, of what's happening. And this applies to more than substances. It's a general behavior. Actually can be a very helpful thing when they grow up. Like if they were able to balance this with all these other skills and have maturity, risk taking can be a good thing. If you are having a startup business, or you see what I'm saying? We are evolutionarily as human beings rewarded for taking certain risks. So we have this for a reason. It's not a defect. Okay. It's just that in modern society with lots of resources and a lot of things happening, there are these psychological traits that can be predictive if we're not careful.
When I used to take care of kids in the office, I used to watch these, especially 9-month-olds. And there was a group of them who this had nothing to do with what they were socialized to do. They're 9 months old. They would try to take a flyer off the exam table. They loved the feeling of movement and uncertainty and whatever that thing, I don't want to put a label on it. They're 9 months old. They couldn't tell me, but and I used to say to the parents, you've got a 9-month-old who's trying to take a flyer off my table, like intentionally, not accidentally, like really intentional. I'd say, report back. Let me know if that kid loves risk. And to a parent, they would come back 4 and 5 and 6 years later and say, you called it when they were 9 months old. My kid loves the feeling of taking risks. My kid will scale the highest tree in the neighborhood and try to jump off it. It's the feeling they love. I always, Joe, given my own personal path through medical training and working in this field, I always put 2 and 2 together in my head and thought, those are kids who are probably at risk for substance use disorders as well. Is that fair? That they just love the feeling of that rush? Or did I get that completely wrong?
No, I think that's partially correct. I think where I would put some context is that just like impulsivity, thrill seeking is not a one-to-one. It doesn't overlap perfectly with risk taking. Meaning, the reason I say that is I will see a number of kids who are horribly anxious, okay, will not strike you as the, you know what I mean, daredevil.
Got it. Right.
But when you kind of psychologically study them, they are absolutely risk-taking, but they have paralyzing anxiety too. So they don't look like impulsive people, but they are in their psychology risk-taking people. Risk-taking people sometimes that I've seen, they tend to be a little bit more consequential in their decision-making. Like they're a little bit more willing to be no harm, no foul. And they're kind of, right? Like they're good kids. They have right and wrong, but they can kind of, hey, I'm not going to live in the past. I got to, move forward.
Moving on.
And so you find this in the psychology. And so there's a lot of variables like that are predictive. And then once they have the addiction, it's very clear to see.
So Joe, for people listening who are like, oh shit, like you're describing my kid, but it's not destiny. And there are ways to fulfill that sort of temperamental inclination of a kid in ways that are not dangerous for them, but actually quite like creative or exciting or wonderful. So what do you say to a parent who's like, oh, my kid's got that temperament? Are there things I can get them involved in or have them, sports or activities they can do to sort of fill that need so that they're not turning to substances to get that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. Statistically, I think you could argue that even the majority of kids who are thrill-seeking, impulsive, and risk-taking are not going to develop an addiction. Okay, so it's just all we're saying is the risk is higher. You know what I mean? But then, so as a parent, you want to think about that decision making and play it out to how it will affect them in different parts of their life. When they're at a party and someone hands them something. When they're in a situation where they can, cut some corners and not tell their parents about it, then you can map this out into actual scenarios. And you want to harness kind of the value-driven skills that you want, the kind of decision making. It's not morality. It's not, they know the difference between, good and bad, but, harnessing empathic skills, having them think 360 about a situation, for example, right? So like your impulse might be to like, okay, this thing happened, but I can just take the win really quickly and you know what I mean? And not worry about the thing, but I've had enough exposure. Like, my parents I'm making this up, but we've had these volunteer experiences and I've heard from them talk about my uncle and different things. So now I can imagine a little bit more what it looks like in 3 dimensions, not just from how I see it, but in 360 mode. And this isn't rocket science. If you actually look at the fascinating and awesome lives of people in recovery, and there are millions of people in recovery. So one of the messages people should hear is addiction is not a black hole to avoid. In fact, compared to other chronic illnesses, certainly in the news you hear the overdoses and the things like that, but percentage-wise, the recovery rates for addiction are very high. People actually do very well compared to diabetes, heart disease. They do very well, and so we just got to keep them engaged. There's a lot of ups and downs. There's return to use and all that in between, but the prognosis isn't grim necessarily. Okay, and so. That said, I think you study these people in recovery and the kind of things they have. And the thing that I would say almost universally with people in recovery is that they are kind of the best version of themselves. They live a value-oriented life. They connect with other people. They empathize well. They volunteer. They give of themselves in ways that are absolutely amazing. And if you could teach young people to live like that without having to go through some of the suffering that they had to go through, our world would be a starkly different place.
Oh, I love that.
So if we have people listening who have a kid they're worried about, and they sort of are up at night, and that, one night it's like, I think my kid's got a problem. And the next night they're like, no, I think we're good. I think it's okay. What's your advice? What's your guidance to a parent? As you say, motivational interview therapy, right? It's about that ambivalence. And I feel like that can apply not just to the person in recovery, but the person caring for someone who may be struggling. What's your advice to that person, Joe?
My advice would be to listen to their instincts. I think next to that person, family members probably know that person the best, a lot better than anyone else will. And I would follow that instinct and talk to somebody. And hopefully that person will listen. And through that listening process, that person will come to their own conclusion about maybe they are overly worried because they've had family members go down this path, and that fear is really making it cloudy, and making it hard. Maybe they're overreacting slightly. Or maybe they really have a gut feeling, that something's happening and they don't want to face the music. And I think all of that unfolds. But as human beings, when we're not in emotional distress, we actually, as creatures, have an amazing ability to pick up instinctively, like what's happening around us. It is when we get clouded by, difficult emotions, and, then we tend to project our feelings, and it gets all messed up. But we have the ability to what I would call mentalize, see things in other people. And we just don't know how to translate that instinct into like what it means. But as creatures, we have that ability. And I would tell parents to follow that instinct. It may not always be right, but see where it takes you.
And how do we layer on what has changed from when we were younger? So I'm thinking about, the legalization of marijuana in several states and the increased potency, for instance. I mean, this was for so long considered, I hate the term gateway drug, but, it's sort of it's not heroin and it's not cocaine, but, it was just marijuana. And then now we're looking at kids who have very easy access to marijuana that's extraordinarily concentrated. It's a very different drug. How parents are, all adults, frankly, are left a little flat-footed. They don't understand, I think, how to weigh what has shifted. What advice do you have there?
Yeah, my advice, and there's no easy answer here, but I do present some information to them, because people have black and white thinking about substances, and they kind of rank order them in terms of which are more harm. And that is a very silly and non-scientific way to approach it. That's like rating food for everybody, and everyone's going to like it or no one's going to like it. It's a very silly way to look at it. We're all different. So here's some statistics. About a third of Americans who can drink alcohol do not drink alcohol. Okay. Another third of Americans, about 30% or so, drink less than one alcoholic beverage a week. So 60% of Americans drink less than one alcoholic beverage a week. There's a book called Paying the Tab that was written some years ago that illustrated this example. And 20% of Americans drink 80% of the alcohol in the country. So whatever perception you have about legalizing marijuana and a bell curve distribution and everyone's going to smoke one joint should go out the window. 10% of Americans consume 50% of the alcohol in the entire country. Talk about differences, right? And so when you're trying to settle things in the court of public opinion through a vote, whether things should be, you're thinking in a democratic, utilitarian way. As a physician, I'm thinking about that 20%, because those are the people who are going to get in trouble. Those are the people who are going to create an expense. And I mean, in more ways than money, you know what I mean? For all of society. And those are the people I am supposed to protect. Right. And so this kind of majority rules, 80% of people are okay. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so the first thing is you can't think of substances as just kind of some uniform bell curve kind of deal. And the second thing you should think about is the power of consumerism in our society. It drives everything, social media, whatever. It's all click, click, buy, differentiate yourself. So when you combine the fact that 20% consume 80% of a thing, that's called a Pareto distribution, and you combine that with consumerism, people who sell lottery tickets, video games, alcohol, nicotine, anything that people can get carried away with, when they look at their P&L and all their business stuff, who are they targeting? Are they targeting the 60% of Americans who don't drink? No. These are economies that, if you're not careful, are predatory by nature. Mm-hmm. So what you see in America is exactly this play out. You see it with nicotine way back in the day, advertising to young people because they want people hooked early and they're targeting that 20%. You see it with alcohol. Now they're targeting women. They're like, and with great impact, which is creating all kinds of health problems for women, not just in this country, but other modern nations. And you see it with cannabis, even with adults, under the guise of, yes, we should reverse the war on drugs. Yes, we shouldn't have a punitive approach for a health condition. But this kind of very simple majority rules thing has created a explosive growth in daily marijuana consumption for adults. And those companies, those enterprises are always going to target that 10 to 20% because that's where their profit margin comes from. If they do not advertise to them, they will not make money. So they have a choice and we have a choice. I'm not therefore saying it should be one way or the other, but as kind of mature citizens, that really is the truth of what's driving the conversation.
Some people argue that we should actually call today's weed products like a different drug because of the potency and the medical impact, the biological impact. You talked earlier about a sort of a hemp-derived product that has what you said the impact was.
THC. Yeah, you can get it from hemp. It can be synthetic, and then it's just the latest way to bypass, legal policies and whatnot. And
so what's your thinking on that? Like, because we're like, oh, it's just weed, it's no big deal. And meanwhile, it is a big deal. What's your feeling about sort of like, I hate to call it the branding, but like kind of the branding in the context of kids' safety and talking about these drugs?
Yeah, I think the playbook for the cannabis industry has been very much like the vaping industry has been like the nicotine industry. It's the same because you got to target the same people who consume a lot. And so I think there has to be better controls, from a regulatory standpoint on the capitalistic drive, the consumerism related to it. The consumerism is riding on the coattails of things that sound right and are right, but that's not their motive, right? The industry they don't care about racial biases or a war on drugs. They want to sell cannabis to you, and so I think those are things that people really need to think about. And I think those are things that states need to grapple with, as they allow what should be a more scientific health discussion into a kind of a democratic forum.
Mm-hmm. And kids hate to be manipulated. And it's an amazing place to start a conversation with them, because if they start to appreciate, or if they're asked to weigh in on a conversation about how advertisers might be advertising to you and dispensaries might be trying to hook consumers, if you do it in a really non-judgmental way, it's a really interesting conversation, and the kids will often lead it. It doesn't mean it saves them from going down this road, but it's just shining a light on one more corner of all of this.
That's right. I think one of the things in therapy sessions I always try to do, and it's a motivational interviewing thing too, is to emphasize autonomy. Young people really want to believe as much as possible that they are the masters of their own destiny, that it's not some substance, it's not some corporation. And this was really the success, Cara, behind the decrease in nicotine consumption before the vaping stuff happened. Is a lot of really smart commercials and public health campaigns showing the corporate side of the machinery. And there's a lot of truth in it too, where nobody likes being manipulated like that. But that is what the industry is. And so I think we can be in a place where we are non-judgmental about people who are using substances, right? We are compassionate. We see substance use disorders as a health issue. We can do all of that stuff and regulate the consumerism that has run away and will eventually drive the conversation whether we like it or not.
Mm-hmm. Joe, I feel like we could keep you here for hours and hours to ask you all of our questions. This was totally fascinating. I am going to employ motivational interview therapy without certification or training, unlike you, in my house. I hope you will come back. There's so much more to talk about. I so appreciate your commitment to this, but also your respect for the humanity of all people, and that there is a path and a successful, vibrant future for people who are in recovery. And I hope that gives listeners hope that if that's something they're struggling with in their own homes and their own families, that you see the other end of it. And there's a lot of beautiful, wonderful outcomes on the other side of this journey.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Hope is not just a value or a phrase, it is a perspective that activates action, and it's a beautiful thing. And again, from the recovery community perspective, when you see all these wonderful people in recovery for all the things that are broken in the world, it makes you believe in humanity. It makes you believe in all the things that it was worth the journey when you're surrounded by recovery people and a recovery mission like Hazelden Betty Ford. Love to come back anytime. We can take live callers and try the
Let's do
stuff
it.
out in person. That'd be a lot of fun, right? Just kind of try some stuff out. But no, it's been wonderful connecting with you both, and thank you for the service you're providing. All the young people and their parents.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.